we're not going to go into any amount of depth on any one particular fruit tonight, and instead hope to kind of think about some broader principles and where to go to get some resources that are really going to help you move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and get my window up here. All right. So I think we've covered the intro slide here pretty thoroughly. So one of the first questions, just kind of easy thing to start with, is why do we want to grow berries? And that's, for most of you, probably a pretty easy question. And it starts with, they're really yummy. You really enjoy eating berries. And if you've ever tried buying berries, either in a grocery store or at a farmer's market, you realize they are not cheap. And so they are a high value crop. And you may or may not have been pleased with the quality and selection that you found available to you. So those things make them a really interesting opportunity when you're looking at growing berries, when you've got plenty of space, either growing them for your own use, growing them for a market option. You've got that knowledge that they're high value and the market is not exactly flooded. You know, if you're looking at tomatoes, the market is often flooded, except in the years when there's not a tomato to be had anywhere. But the fruit crops, I can't think of any market I've been to in Kansas on a consistent basis that, you know, someone would tell you this market has too much fruit. It simply doesn't happen. I can't think of, especially in 2020, you know, the U-pick operations that were in this area. I don't think there was a single one that said we had too much fruit. Everyone was selling out because it was a great outdoor activity. And I really hope that those experiences kind of continue forward. You know, some families and folks discovered those opportunities and are going to want to continue those opportunities even after the pandemic's over. So nutrition, high value, you know, again, whether for personal or for sale use, lots of great reasons to grow berries. I want to start tonight by talking about the more sales side of things. So I know some of you aren't really interested in this side, but you may pick up some thoughts, or maybe I'll inspire you. I don't know. But we're going to kind of run through some of these different components of berries. So one of the first things when you're dealing with fruit, when you're dealing with any crop, is how are you going to sell it? And I feel like that's particularly a critical question. It's one of the first questions I want you to answer with regards to growing fruit on your acreage is, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to sell it? And are people coming to your farm, or are you taking that fruit off the farm? If you're selling if you're selling from your farm, you need to really consider your location, your signage. How are people going to get there? Because if you're too far off the beaten path, people are not going to find you, and you're not going to have the customer base that you might need. So really consider your location, your customer base, and things like that. Another really important factor is the harvest labor, you know, when you're considering your sales methods, because if you're taking the fruit off the farm to a farmer's market or a CSA or something like that, someone has to pick it. And that means that someone has to be paid to pick it. Even if you are the one picking it, you know, you're paying with your time, that you're not doing something else. And then your storage facilities. So fruit, berries are very perishable products. They do not last long, and if they are not properly cooled and stored, their shelf life is often, you know, 24 hours or less. They're not going to last. You know, I don't have a huge acreage. I just have my backyard, and that works just fine for me because most of the time the fruit doesn't even get into the house with the kids. But on a larger scale, storage is going to become so critical to getting your crops harvested, getting them to your marketplace. If you think that on-farm sales are the route you want to go, whether it's you pick, whether it's a farm stand, if I'm going to be honest, most places end up, they start with a farm stand or they start with you pick, but they ultimately end up doing both. You really need to consider is keeping your farm clean enough to have customers on regularly your cup of tea, because it's not everyone's cup of tea, to keep the weeds down and keep the paths mowed and everything spick and span and all that sort of thing. Doesn't make you a bad grower if that's not your deal. But if you're going to have people coming onto your farm, that is a really important aspect. Same thing with your farm layout. Some of you are probably dealing with a blank slate. You have lots of choices as to where you could put fruit and how you could design your parking areas and your work areas and all of those sorts of things. And some of you probably have a mature farm. You have a mature layout, you have existing buildings, existing roads, and you don't have a whole lot of flexibility to move things around. So that is going to impact whether doing you pick or other types of on-farm sales are going to work for you. And simple things like parking spaces. Do you have a spot that you can turn into a parking area, or an area that you can use for overflow parking? And is that area a bog when it rains? Is that going to work for you? So there's just all of these factors that before you invest in going this direction of you pick or farm stand sales, that you really need to consider. And I really emphasize, doing some of this, penciling it out, measuring things, thinking about different layouts and traffic flow and all of these considerations that don't seem fun. They don't seem like growing fruit. They maybe aren't what you thought you were getting into, but it's so critical, because if you don't think about them in advance, you run the risk of putting a big investment in fruit plants and infrastructure, and then you either can't sell it or it doesn't work out. So you really have to think about what your market is going to bear and what's a good fit for your family, for your property. What works for you. When are people going to come pick? What time of year? If you're going to do you pick, what time of year are people coming out to the farm to pick? And who's your customer base? Are they busy at that time of year? Are they going to come pick strawberries in May? Or are they busy with other stuff in May? If you're gonna have blackberries, are they gonna come pick blackberries when it's really hot, or are they not likely to do that? So when is that market? Are they willing to come early in the morning? All of these questions that you need to ask about your potential customer base. And then, on the flip side, if you are going to go to a market, take your produce to the farmer's market, sell it to a retail outlet or other options like that, when do you have the labor you need to get that fruit to the market? If you're going to rely on maybe high school students or your children as high school students as important harvest labor, then maybe May is not a great choice. They're really busy with end of school year things. So strawberries might not be a great option. Maybe you need to focus on a later crop, and those sorts of things. Already mentioned, if you're doing pick your own, doing a farm stand, location is key. But I will also say that I have seen successful U-pick operations that seem like they're in a location that doesn't make sense if they work really hard at doing great signage and great PR, great marketing. They will get people to their spot if they do a good job with their signage, their promotions, and they have a product that's worth it. If you go 6 miles down a winding dirt road and you get to a place and it doesn't have good signage and you don't know for sure where you're supposed to be, are you in the right spot? There's sketchy dogs, there's trash, there's old machinery rusting, I'm going to turn around and leave. Like I don't know where I'm supposed to be. You know, so there's ways to do it well, even if you're off the beaten path. And again, can't emphasize enough that berries don't store well, they don't travel well. You know, there's things you can do as far as choosing good varieties that are going to make transportation easier and more successful. But even then, you know, you've got sometimes only 1 to 3 days to get your fruit to where it's going to be in the hands of the end customer. Some guidelines if you're looking at that, pick your own. These are some guidelines that I got several years ago from Bill and Brenda Reed. They're part of the K-State extension, and Brenda has a U-Pick berry farm down in the Chautauqua area. And you know, that's on your resource list. Literally wrote the textbook on growing fruits and nuts. And so these are some guidelines that they like is need about 300 to 450 pickers per acre per season. So that's a lot of bodies. And do you have enough people that are willing to do that? Some of that is going to depend, you know, are you in an area where you're likely to have people come, you know, like my family did U-Picks, went to a U-Pick strawberry up every year, and we would pick 40 to 50 pounds of strawberries. You know, so we would clean out several rows of berries. But other people, you know, in other locations, they're more hobby pickers. They're going to come and they're going to pick, you know, 3 or 4 quarts of berries that are, you know, maybe 5 pounds total. You know, it's a fun outing, and they're going to take them home and eat them fresh, and that's the end of it. Um, so you do want to assess who your pickers are going to be and what they're interested in doing. Often you're looking at about 15 to 30 pickers per acre per day, particularly at the peak of your harvest season. And for anyone that does U-Pick, there is actually a lot of management involved in assess how many berries are in the field, how many pickers do you need, making sure that you're going to have the number of pickers you need and that you don't get picked out, you know, unless you just have more acreage than you can have U-Pick in a given day. So you're going to have supplemental pickers that you're paying then to harvest your fruit. But you'll have to have some kind of system to manage how many people are coming and how many pounds or quarts or pints or gallons, you know, whatever your measurement is of berries. So another guideline, which on one hand, I feel like it's kind of low. I think in 2020, this was definitely, but is an interesting guideline is to say that you can expect about 3% of the population within a 30-minute drive of your farm to be interested in a U-Pick type operation, because it's not for everyone. Some people just want to buy pre-picked berries. So, you know, depending on where you plunk your farm, you know, you might be able to rope in about 14,000 people county that are interested in that U-Pick, not counting all the other surrounding areas. And I think probably the population has increased since I crunched that number. But you know, if we're looking at 450 pickers per acre, 14,000 people, you know, even with that low percentage, that's a lot of acres of berries. You know, that's getting close to 30 acres of berries potentially per crop, per type of berry. So I would say the market is nowhere near flush, nowhere near full with the potential for U-Pick. So keep that in mind. We've talked about the storage. Things need to cool down quickly. Picture here is a berry farm that they, you know, wired out. It's kind of a sad old looking refrigerator chest, probably a chest freezer that they rewired to do refrigeration. But berries need to be stored at about 32 degrees, so just right at the freezing line for water. and 90 to 95% humidity to maintain their peak quality. So usually you're picking early in the morning, getting it into storage right away. A lot of times folks, try to pick and get to market as soon as possible to maintain that quality. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is whether or not you are growing for your own use or growing for sale, is the times that labor needs are really high with your berry plants. Planting, of course, is a high labor endeavor. The plus side of most of your berries, strawberries, can be an exception on that, is that you're planting perennials, so hopefully you are planting once every several years or maybe decades depending on how good you are. Strawberries, depending on your growing method, you could be years. Usually I would recommend you're probably planting something every year with strawberries. And then most of our fruit plants have pruning needs in the late winter, early spring. So you're going to need some hands on deck for that pruning season, kind of February, March, maybe January, depending on the season and the amount you've got to do. The reality is the larger the berry operation, the fruit operation, the earlier they have to start pruning to get it all done. So a lot of times they'll start pruning as soon as the dormant in December, and they just prune every time the weather is decent until it's all done, hopefully end of February, beginning of March. Harvesting, again, really high labor time period. And then the last one, berries weeding can be a high labor piece of the puzzle. Hopefully with some of your other berries, weeding is not such a critical consideration with some of those perennial plants, but for strawberries, weeding can be a really big. When we're doing harvest containers, when we're doing harvest with berries, they're soft fruits, they really need shallow containers. If you've ever done any kind of berry picking or berry buying, you've probably either seen the plastic clamshells or these blueberry boxes, kind of the pressed paper berry boxes. So they're popular for a reason. They have decent airflow, they help the fruit cool down in storage. They can wick some moisture away from the berries a little bit, and they're shallow, the berries, if you fill them to the top. On average, I would say a good, solid, experienced picker can pick about 10 pounds of berries an hour. Um, an experienced fast picker is, depending on the circumstances, is going to be able to pick 15 or more pounds per hour. Your inexperienced picker, which, kind of your inexperienced U-pick picker, experienced high school student is maybe only going to pick 5 to 8 pounds per hour, depending on how easy the picking is on a given day. Ideally, when harvesting overripe and diseased fruit, damaged fruit is culled during the harvest process. You don't ever want that diseased, damaged, overripe fruit going into the containers because it's going to spread quickly. These soft fruits will start developing gray mold within 24 hours, and a rotten strawberry is just going to make the whole carton a mess pretty quickly. Harvest window, during that harvest season with any of our berry fruits, usually you're looking at picking every 1 to 3 days. That depends a little bit on the weather. When you're ripening, when your harvest window falls during a warmer part of the season, you probably are going to be picking almost every day. If not every single day. If it's ripening and we have a little bit of a cold spell, then things are going to slow up a little bit, and it's going to take a couple more days between major pickings to ripen. And from a U-pick standpoint or a commercial standpoint, this is also where training your harvesters becomes really important, because you want to harvest the peak quality fruit. You don't want to harvest fruit when it's too immature or over mature. and is one of the challenges about a U-pick operation. How do you train inexperienced pickers on how to pick appropriately, how to pick clean, so that they're not leaving fruit behind that is good quality fruit, but how not to pick things that aren't really ready that they're going to be unhappy with. Some property characteristics to think when and we'll talk more about specific site selection aspects for different types of fruit, but some of the property characteristics you'll want to think about is your soil type and your soil drainage, your water flow, and how water stands in your area. You'll want to think about your existing trees and windbreaks, how mature they are, where they're located. It's really, really helpful if your property already has some windbreaks on it, because anything that's going to damage that fruit can be a challenge to deal with. Your existing buildings or spaces that you driveway, parking, storage units, all of those different things are aspects of your property that you want to keep in mind. And it's really tempting when you're looking at your property, to say, oh, I think I want, I've got 5 acres, so I can plant 5 acres of strawberries. Well, in reality, by the time you figure out your workspaces, your storage areas, your equipment spaces, paths and spaces to turn equipment around and, prepare the materials that you need and do irrigation and all of those things, you may have 2, maybe 3 acres of usable space. But you can't just plant plant your berries, wall to wall, because you need those workspaces. They're important as well. Whether you are doing just for yourself or for a for-profit enterprise, think about the investment costs, and the amount of space that you're going to plant does impact the types of purchases that you're going to need to make. You're most likely going to need some specialized equipment of some, unless you're just extremely small scale. So what is that equipment, and what find that's used? What do I need to buy new? What can I kind of do by hand to start with, and further purchases, all of those equipment startup costs. Trellises, unless you're doing like strawberries or blueberries, things like that, your blackberries, raspberries, grapevines, they need some trellising. And so that also plant your plants now and like, oh, I'll just buy the trellises later, because when you are planting. The buildings and the plant, a packet of seeds, and you're well on your way. It's a fairly low cost investment, but when we're dealing with from seed, you're buying propagated plants. Often they're bare root plants, and in fact, you're planting stock and things like that. Buying bulk, and things like that, you're still going to run into some significant costs with your plants. If you're doing a for-profit type operation, you really want to think about your growing methods and interested in doing. Are you looking for an organic, it kind of marries some of the conventional, some of the organic methods? Are you looking for a straight up conventional production method? And so part of that is for sure your own ethic. Part of that is your customer's ethic. What are they going to buy? Are they going to purchase from you if it is not organic? Are they going to purchase from you if it's organic, and because of that it's too expensive for them to bear the cost? There's going to be different levels of hand labor, particularly with weeding and some of the pest control, from the organic to the conventional. And technology isn't necessarily only conventional. There's one of the things that I always encourage folks to consider is that sometimes higher levels of technology, better equipment, and things like that can actually make organic production more viable and easier to do. So investing in the right equipment, the right level of technology. So this piece of equipment here, if I remember correctly, was actually kind of a grape harvester that they were mocking up at this farm that we were visiting. I don't know, Scott, if you remember this at all, but I think that's what they were doing, was they were working on figuring out how to mechanically harvest grapes.
I do remember that. That was an outstanding trip.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I encourage you to think about when you are considering fruit is our perennial fruit plants are very susceptible to extreme weather. And because of that, you need to keep diversification in mind. You know, if growing a 1/4 acre of strawberries is kind of a side project, and if you lose money one year and make money the next year, it doesn't matter, then maybe it's not such a big deal. But if you are really trying to bring in a portion of your income using that fruit planting, you really want to think about several types of diversification. One of them being, you know, for each type of fruit you want to grow, consider, can I plant not just one variety, but can I plant 5 or 6 or 8 varieties that are going to take that harvest season and make it, instead of a 2-week harvest season, now I'm harvesting this particular crop for 5 or 6 weeks. So can you spread that harvest season out? That way, if we get a late freeze or we have, you know, a flooding rain, we only lose part of our crop and part of our season rather than the entire crop, the entire season. So, you know, consider all of those potential weather challenges. One of the things that I found really interesting when I first moved to Kansas and you notice it the most with strawberries, I think, because they're the first fruit kind of early in the season. Some years, your strawberry harvest window starts like the last week of April, the first week of May. And other years, your strawberry harvest window starts like the 3rd or 4th week of May. So there's a 4 to 5 week variation between the harvest season for strawberries. And that just has to do with the spring weather, how early it gets warm and how consistently it stays warm. And so that can be an added challenge to your situation. And then, you know, so spreading your harvest season, keep that in mind, be very flexible, and, you know, probably consider more than just one thing. You know, some folks, again, like they just want to do strawberry you pick, that's what they do. You know, it happens or it doesn't happen. And you know, that's the end of it. But you could also look at it that, okay, this is my strawberry season, now I'm going to have blackberry season, now I'm going to have grape season, you know, so that you have a wider range of harvest seasons, different things available at different times, that are going to keep customers coming to you on a regular basis. Yeah, and then just always be flexible and open to adding something new, making a change if you see a niche appear that you feel like you can take advantage of and nobody else is really doing. And then the last piece of thinking about berries in a commercial sense is, most likely you are going to have fruit that no one has purchased. And what are you going to do with that? Are you going to just chuck it into the compost pile and let the green June beetles and the birds and the critters have at it? Or are you going to take that high value product and turn it into something else? You know, jams, jellies, syrups, preserves, ciders, all of those different things, maybe some baked goods. Those of you in the Wichita area, if you're familiar with Elderslie Farm, I think they have done a bang up job of this sort of thing. Just adding different products to their line. So that value added and the agritourism aspect, you get to the point where you're not just selling fruit, you're selling the experience of coming out and picking the fruit and eating the stuff that maybe you wouldn't have made yourself and that sort of thing. And then, not forgetting that pre-picked option, having some fruit pre-picked that people can purchase in addition. They was, but I still want more fruit, so I'm going to buy some pre-picked. So these are just some pictures of some farms doing some different sorts of things, all the way from the very low key, refrigerated station out in the middle of the field, some youth activities, looking at plants on your plate, some educational things. This top right corner, Scott, I don't know if you remember this as well. So this is a blueberry farm in Missouri, and their big deal, like it's blueberry you pick, but their big deal is they sell these cumulobulbous muffins. And so these are gigantic muffins that are hot, and then they put ice cream and whipped cream and fresh blueberries on top of it. And at the time, this was 10 years ago, so they were selling them for $6 a piece. I would imagine that price has gone up since then. But like that was as much the experience of what it meant to go to their farm as the blueberry picking itself. And so I think definitely a lot of, especially in the Wichita area, if you're near a little more populated area, you're gonna do just as well selling those sorts of things as the actual berries themselves. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. I've thrown a lot of things to think about for those of you interested in the production commercial side. Does anyone have any burning questions or thoughts on any of that?
One of my questions is, how do we know whether the acreage we have, the ground is going to be good for growing berries? I mean, how do we figure that out?
Yep. So I think we'll give a start to answering some of those questions in this next section. We're going to talk quite a bit about site selection and some of those characteristics. So we're going to get to that. So I see in the chat a question about strawberries that are not dormant and the best way to protect the plant. So one of the things I'll say is strawberries are extremely cold tolerant. Generally, the recommendation in Kansas is that for strawberries, once we've had a couple of harder freezes, usually sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we would put a straw mulch down. And the straw mulch is not necessarily to protect them from the cold, because strawberries, so I worked for a couple summers on a research farm in northern Minnesota, very cold, and they grew strawberries with no mulch because the plant itself is extremely cold tolerant. It's cold tolerant typically to zone 3 or 4 without mulching. So temperatures in the teens, not going to kill a strawberry plant, even if they're not fully dormant. Beyond that, my recommendation would be to put down a relatively light layer of straw mulch, because the straw is actually going to keep the soil a little bit colder, and it's going to keep the temperature where those plants are growing a little bit more uniform. So they're less likely to go the up and down with the temperatures and the going dormant, coming out of dormancy, and all of those sorts of things. So a lot of times folks have this idea mulch is for to protect things from freezing. In the case of some of our perennials, the mulch is actually to keep the temperature more uniform so that it's not freezing and thawing and heaving out of the ground and doing all that sort of thing. Okay. So let's look at some of our berry growing aspects. So first thing I want to talk about is our planting stock. Regardless of what type of fruit you want to plant, if you're going to invest in a perennial plant, particularly a larger planting area, even if you're just growing for yourself and you're wanting to grow, a quarter acre or half acre, that is a lot of fruit, that is a lot of plants, that is a significant investment. So you want high quality plants. Most of our small fruits are going to be purchased most cost effectively as dormant bare root plants. You can get bundles of the dormant bare root plants from any number of nurseries, catalogs, and things like that. Often in bundles of 15 or 25, or depending on your scale, 50, 500, 1,000, all of those things like that. And those dormant plants are typically planted in the early spring. Sometimes, particularly with strawberries or some of your brambles, you can get tissue cultured plants that are certified virus or disease free. That's often a great choice simply because one of the biggest limiting factors is that potential for viruses and diseases, and that can really start to reduce your yield over time. And so starting with plants that are disease-free, that are tissue cultured or at least certified disease-free are a great choice. And a really reputable nursery or garden center, usually a garden center is buying wholesale from a larger place, but if you're gonna get a larger volume of plants from a commercial nursery that caters to larger growers is gonna have really great planting stock. If you get plants that are actively growing, you probably wanna wait to put them in until closer to your last frost or slightly after. So let's look at strawberries really quick. We are going to bomb through all of these different fruits. Like I said, I'm going to give you enough information to get started. There's so much more out there. And a lot of times we think about strawberries, kind of in the traditional method. I did want to show a couple of other pictures here. This one is strawberries growing on plastic covered raised beds. These are typically like an annual production method. So you're planting the plants and letting them grow, harvest the fruits, and then pulling those plants out like they're an annual crop. And so certain varieties are better adapted to this. A lot of the day neutral varieties are well adapted to this type of method as well. And I just really love this picture because it's so beautiful and so inspiring, and looks like a lot of money to get planted and get started. But so this is basically a raised hydroponic type system. You can see the tube a little bit and the plants hanging down. And so one of the challenges with strawberries is all the bending to pick. And so, this is a commercial setup, obviously, and they're doing the hydroponics and they put it up high so that you're picking right at chest height. It's much more efficient and ergonomic for your pickers than on the ground. So something interesting if you're looking for something a little bit different. Definitely a higher cost of getting started to do that though. So assuming most of you are probably looking at starting with a more traditional production method, strawberries like a well-drained soil. So one of the things you'll want to look at and consider is your drainage properties of your soil. Everything, I always say everything prefers sandy loam. Strawberries are no exception. That doesn't mean if you don't have sandy loam, you can't grow strawberries. You absolutely can. But you're likely going to be doing some sort of berm or raised bed, even in a perennial system, so that you have better drainage with your heavy soils. If you do have a property with a heavier clay soil, you really want to kind of assess your property. And honestly, these guidelines come into play for any fruit plant, whether you're looking at strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, grapes, blueberries, currants, gooseberries, like you name it, pretty much this is gonna be the case. If you don't have well-drained soil, you're gonna wanna look at your property, figure out, are there places where water stands, and avoid those areas? Are there places where water drains better? Those are gonna be better choices. And then consider, do I need constructed raised beds or bermed raised beds? Or, if I'm in a commercial setting, maybe I'm going to do the plastic covered raised bed type system for strawberries. The flip side is, if you have that really well drained soil that's really sandy, you're going to need a lot of water, particularly during that ripening window, but often lots of parts of the year. Soil pH for strawberries, the ideal range is kind of about 5.8 to 6.5, slightly more acidic than we look at with our vegetable crops. And that's also very common with most of our fruits. They're looking at slightly more acidic than some of the vegetable crops. Doesn't mean they won't grow if the soil is more alkaline, but they're going to be more productive with that slight more acidity. And so again, if your soil pH isn't in this range, there's things you can do to correct that. So if you're trying to figure these things out, getting a soil test either through your extension office or a private lab is going to help you out with your pH, your nutrient levels. If you're wondering about, is my soil well drained? What type of soil is it? So for those of you in Sedgwick County, I'm always happy to come out and help you do a site assessment, help you look at your soil, understand the characteristics of your property and what's going to work well. For those of you in other counties, my guess would be that you'll have an ag agent or a hort agent that might be willing to do something like that as well. Another thing to take a look at is the NRCS Web Soil Survey. If you can pinpoint your location, put your address in, it will tell you what kind of soil you have and what type of characteristics it has. So I really encourage folks to really investigate all of these things, get a soil test done, look at your water tests, get on the web soil survey before you start pulling the trigger and buying plants and equipment and all of that stuff. Beyond that, fruiting plants, strawberries, all fruiting plants need full sun. And that's really key to good quality fruit production. They also, with strawberries, this is probably the most important since they're the ones fruiting in the early part of the season. You don't want to plant them in a spot where cold air is going to settle. And that is because your bloom time is during the window when we tend to have late freezes. So if you can avoid putting your strawberries in that spot where it's always the one that's got a little bit of frost when everything else doesn't, you want to avoid those spots. The other thing with strawberries in particular, and this, it's kind of funny that it's even on the slide to say avoid weedy or grassy areas because this is a grassland. But what that really is meaning is if you've got an area that is just overtaken with bindweed and Bermuda grass and all kinds of nasty weeds that hasn't been cared for, that is not the place to go till it up and plunk some strawberry plants in because those weeds are going to overtake that area before you ever get a berry crop off of it. If you want to do berries, if you want to do perennial culture berries, in particular, you need to pick your spot and plan ahead and spend a full year getting that cleaned out, getting the weeds, getting the perennial grasses, perennial weeds out of that area as best you can, maybe even longer, depending on how in how poor of condition it is to start with. If you have an area that's been a little better maintained, that might be a better place to start with some strawberries. And that's because the biggest limiting factor to strawberry production is the weeds, the weed management. And once the planting gets too thick and full of weeds, the yield is going to really decrease, the berry size is going to decrease, and everyone is going to hate it. They're going to hate the weeding, they're going to hate the picking, they're going to hate everything about it, and you're going to end up tilling it under. With strawberries, we have some different types of strawberries. Primarily, I want to talk about June bearing and day neutral. Ever bearing is kind of this weird little in-between group that has, sometimes they overlap with the day neutral, sometimes they don't. So June bearing strawberries are the ones that bear in the spring. They have kind of that traditional life cycle that you may be used to thinking about, where they fruit for a couple weeks in the spring, they have a whole bunch of fruit at one time, and then they don't produce fruit the rest of the year. Your day neutral varieties have the ability to produce fruit any time of year that the weather is right. The catch with day neutrals in Kansas is that they tend not to set fruit when the weather is over 85 degrees, which means that they really don't produce most of the summer unless we have an extremely mild summer. And then, so you're more likely to see a spring crop, a fall crop, or do something with that, and then you may be able to do some day neutral things in high tunnels to kind of get a longer harvest season going as well, either earlier in the spring, later in the fall, sorts of situations. So June bearing strawberries, what most people start with or are comfortable with, usually in Kansas, they're producing sometime in May, susceptible to those April frosts. And the key with them is you can have a really large yield in a short period of time. So depending on the variety, on the weather, on your location, and on your skill as a grower, you could have 5,000 to 15,000 pounds of strawberries per acre. That is a lot of strawberries. So even those of you thinking about a quarter acre, like a quarter acre of strawberries, it could still be, 1 to 3,000 pounds of strawberries on that quarter acre. So on one hand, that is a lot of fruit. On the other hand, once you start building up a customer base, that goes really, really, really fast. So it's both a huge amount of fruit and very little fruit all at the same time. Strawberry growth habit. Strawberries are this low growing perennial plant. They have the crown, the growing point is really close to the soil surface. And then it has its cluster of leaves, and then it has these runners. And the runners are a really important part of the production of strawberries. They're kind of how the plant rejuvenates itself and continues growing. So like our day neutrals, and when we're doing annual culture, the runners are actually not as important, but with a perennial strawberry planting, those runners are critical to maintaining health. And then strawberries, the blossoms occur on these clusters, and then the berries form in those clusters as well. And usually usually what happens with strawberries is the first fruit that ripen are really large and there's only a few of them, and then the next cluster of fruit is a little bit smaller, but there's twice as many of them, and then the next cluster of fruit, there's 6 times as many, and they're, medium sized, and so you get progressively more and more smaller and smaller fruit. So one of the things breeders really work on is plants varieties that are going to maintain berry size into the harvest season. This is another look at how strawberry plants grow. Typically, strawberry plants are planted about 1 plant every 12 to 18 inches, which doesn't seem like a lot, but then those runners grow and fill that space. So you can kind of see this diagram of that initial plant and then the runners coming off of that and filling in that row. So you can kind of see from different angles kind of what that looks like. And there is actually some labor involved with that, getting those. Sometimes the runners grow outside the row where you want them to be, so you have to move them back into the row, and that sort of thing. If you're doing more this space matted row, like sometimes they'll actually come in and prune out runners. I think a lot of times, I'd say the last 5 years, the trend has been towards growing annual culture strawberries and day neutral varieties that don't have as many runners or as vigorous runners, rather than dealing with pruning runners and things like that. So it's been kind of an interesting shift in how strawberries are grown. So we talked about the matted row for perennials, the raised beds system is more for the annual culture. We'll talk a little bit about high tunnels and some of those options later on if we have time and get to it. I don't think Jeff really told me when he expected me to be done, so you guys may be here until midnight. I don't know. My slide set's not that long, I promise. This chart is kind of an interesting look at what strawberries do when they are harvested. So the total yield is the red line and the berry size is the blue line. So it's just another way to think about that. You have, start with a low yield and then it peaks and then drops off and the berry size steadily decreases. And that's kind of unique to strawberries compared to some other berries. Okay, I will take any questions you've got on strawberries. Any one of these fruit topics is probably a 2 to 3 hour class in and of itself, so I can't answer every question you might have, but if you have a burning question, I'm happy to attempt it. No? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you suggest getting rid of weedy areas? I have, I always call it spider grass because we're in such a big area, but crabgrass or whatever. How can I get rid of that without chemical?
Yeah. So the weedy areas, that is going to depend a little bit on the weeds and also the methods that you are comfortable with. So if you are willing to use herbicides, that's relatively straightforward. If you don't want to use herbicides, at that point, you are most likely looking at either some combination of heavy mulch or tarps or tillage. One or the other, or possibly both in some combination to try and kind of work through some of these. Again, a lot of that is going to depend on identifying what your weeds are. Are they perennial weeds? Are they annual weeds? Do you have both? Because your methods are going to be a little different depending on what types of weeds you commonly have. So those are really your options. Your options are herbicides, smothering with mulches, tarps type situation, tillage, or some combination of all of the above. So those are great questions that your local agent can help you with in your specific situation. So a couple other questions in the chat box. So can strawberries thrive at the base of a hardwood tree if soil composition is optimal? So the neat thing about strawberries is they can grow in lots and lots of locations. And if you put them at the base of a tree, they're going to grow, but because they don't have full sun, they're not going to be as productive. So that's really kind of whatever your desire is. If you don't care that they're perfectly productive, no big deal. Growing strawberries in nearly complete sand. In a lot of ways, yeah, you can grow almost anything in nearly complete sand as long as you have nearly unlimited supply of high quality water. And you're also probably going to have to be pretty hands-on with your fertility management. In a lot of ways, growing in essentially blow sand is very similar to growing hydroponically. You're just going to have to continually be adding the nutrients that soil needs, whether through compost or through fertigation, through putting fertilizer through your irrigation system, things like that. Is it a bad idea to try and start from seed? So I think the question would be, what are you trying to start from seed? What type of plants? And where are you getting your seeds from? Most of our fruit plants, to get a high quality cultivar, you need to buy a cultivated variety, which is vegetatively propagated. There are a few seed grown strawberry varieties, but they're not really production oriented. So if you're looking for production, you're going to want a vegetatively propagated variety. Blueberries from seed, extremely difficult to grow from seed, and is going to take a really long time to get a producing blueberry plant from a blueberry seed. So definitely start with a vegetatively propagated plant on that side. The strawberries, you know, it's a little more feasible, but it truly depends what your goal is. If you're just growing it for yourself, you can do lots of things. But if you're trying to manage your cost and how much income you have, you want to get to that production window a lot sooner. What do I mean by high quality water? That is an excellent question, and a very relevant question for Kansas. High quality water, K-State does offer irrigation water quality tests. You can also get those through private labs. When we're looking at high quality water, we're looking at water that is relatively low in salinity, meaning electrical conductivity. It doesn't have a lot of soluble salts in it, as well as water that is low in sodium. So it doesn't have, if it has soluble salts in it, which most Kansas water does have some amount, it has relatively minimal sodium in it. Because those two things can really cause soil damage with regular irrigation, and so those are the two characteristics that you're going to want to take a look at. And sometimes it can be really frustrating. You can have a lot of things lined up the way you think that it's going to work well, and if you don't have high quality water, these horticultural plants just do not tolerate poor quality water. Some of your row crops are going to be more tolerant of higher salts and things like that. Not all of them, but some of them. But your horticulture crops just will not tolerate the high salts and the high sodium. So those are things you want to look at. Okay, raspberries and blackberries. Gonna run through this pretty quickly. A lot of the same things. We like to have good organic matter. Don't want to go too crazy with the fertility on the brambles, but you know, they still need decent fertility. Same deal. Want to avoid the frost pockets. Less critical from a seasonal standpoint, like a late spring frost type of deal. And particularly with blackberries, winter hardiness for some varieties can be a little bit borderline in parts of Kansas, especially those of you further north. Some blackberry varieties are not going to be as winter hardy. So raspberries, two types of raspberries. I can go into a lot more detail on this. I'm just going to hit the highlights tonight. One type is summer bearing, so they tend to produce in the June type window, sometimes May, June, July. There's red, yellow, purple, and black varieties. And in my experience, Kansas is kind of borderline for feasibility for raspberries. You know, from a home garden standpoint, from a personal use standpoint, raspberries do great. They're fine, you know, but when you really start looking at commercial production, if we have a hot June, they can really get bad sun scald, and you can have high losses in crop quality because of that. So, and lots of scorching and things like that. Everbearing, which in my opinion is really more fall bearing raspberries, is a better name for them. These often are going to start producing in August to September, and they're going to produce until frost. And if you don't prune them to all the way to the ground, then they will have a spring. It's a lot easier from a labor standpoint to just prune them straight to the ground. And there's mostly just red and yellow varieties in this category. You know, some years I've had exceptional luck with fall bearing raspberries, really pleased with the fruit quality. Other years, it just depends when it's hot. And this is a great example of needing diversification. I would not put all of my eggs in the raspberry basket in Kansas because depending on when it gets hot and when it gets rainy and when it gets dry, there may or may not produce well in a given year. One of the things that's important to know about both raspberries and blackberries is they have biennial canes. So they have first year canes, which are the primocanes, and then second year canes, which are the floricanes. And so depending on the type, they're going to produce on one or the other or both. And that becomes really important with the pruning and so on and so forth. This conversation, to help you understand all of these details about primocanes and floricanes, is literally a 20 to 30 minute segue presentation all in and of itself. So if you're like, what in the heck is she talking about? Don't worry. But if you really want to get into the raspberries and blackberries, this is an important piece of the puzzle because it's going to impact your pruning practices, understanding how the plants grow, and when they yield and things like that. So typically, the first year cane is the primocane. It does not produce fruit. And then it's that cane's second year of life, it's the floricane, and it produces more fruit. So we're going to leave that there. But if this is really what you're interested in, there's a lot to learn about the different blackberries and raspberries. Types of blackberries and raspberries, or of blackberries, sorry. There's both erect types, there's trailing types, there's semi-erect types, and then there's also thorny and thornless types of blackberries. And so you can find different varieties that kind of get different combinations of erect, semi-erect, trailing, thorny, thornless, so on and so forth. And so it kind of is up to you what your preferences are on growth habits and characteristics. I would say most folks prefer most people growing blackberries prefer growing thornless blackberries, and most folks growing blackberries prefer growing erect types or semi-erect types of blackberries. But sometimes you'll get in a situation where the customers may prefer the flavor of the thorny or the trailing types. So, some interesting opportunities or challenges there. With our raspberries and blackberries, one of the things you have to keep in mind is maintaining that row width because they will spread. They will sucker, they will runner, or not runner, they'll tip, they'll put the tips down and reroot. And so you want to make sure you're maintaining your row width because if it gets too wide, you're going to have disease issues and harvest issues and all kinds of challenges. So some sort of trellis is ideal for most raspberry and blackberry plantings. If it's just for your own personal use and you are just growing raspberries, I don't trellis my raspberries. I just kind of let them do their thing, and occasionally they get a little floppy and then I hack them back and it doesn't bother me. But I'm also not trying to run a U-pick in that type of scenario. So if you're going more a commercial direction, you probably want permanent trellises. There's 3 types, T, Vs, and Is. And depending on the type of trellis, you need more or less posts. So there's some money that goes into posts. I don't think I've got a good picture of a T trellis, but it's exactly what it sounds like. One piece with a cross piece that then has your wires on it. A V trellis, again, exactly what it sounds like. It's got, your posts that are in a V shape, and then the wires suspended between those posts. And then more of an I post, which is just a single post with some wires running along them. So different types of trellising options, different strengths, depending on exactly what varieties you've chosen and what you're doing with your field is going to depend a little bit on what your trellis options look like. Pruning your blackberries and raspberries is critical to the health of your plants. Again, all blackberries and raspberries the canes are only going to live for 2 years. So you're always needing to be removing the dead canes that have lived their full 2-year cycles. You're also going to have situations where they have too many canes. So you're going to have to thin them out, and that's important for disease and insect management. Blackberries and black raspberries, they have this habit where if you let them go, they're going to grow like 10 feet tall. You're going to have a really long cane, and so you actually need to head them back so that they'll put on side shoots, and is going to increase your total yield on that plant 3 to 5 times by correct pruning. So pruning your raspberries and blackberries, again, that is a whole hour-long presentation in and of itself to go through all the different pruning aspects. But getting your pruning done correctly is a really important part, and it's a big piece of the labor late winter, early spring. Harvesting, I think we've talked about this a couple different times. Raspberries in particular, the fruit is so tender. Even blackberries, they must be hand-picked, and a lot of times they're picked right into the sale containers early in the morning and then take them right to market. The less handling, the better. Okay, blueberries. Do I have any questions? Let's see. Strawberries need full sun to flower and produce berries. Yes. The more full sun, the better. And when temps are above 80 degrees, does shading help? To a certain extent, anything that's going to help keep the temperature cooler in the crown of the plant is going to help a little bit. It just depends on how hot we're talking about. If it's 89 degrees shade, yeah, it's probably going to help. If it's 109 degrees, nope, not going to make any difference. And yes, the information on the slides I'm happy to share. I think I'll probably give Jeff or Scott a PDF to send out tomorrow, for sure. Okay, so I included blueberries because I know that blueberries are super popular. Everyone wants to grow blueberries for good reason. They're awesome, they're delicious, they're beautiful, and people want to buy them. So they're very helpful, all of those sorts of things. So the biggest challenge with blueberries is the site selection piece. So the ideal site for blueberries is in Missouri, Arkansas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, New Jersey. I didn't put Oregon on here. Oregon would also be an option. Basically, not Kansas, not a lot of the Great Plains or Central Western states. And the reason for that is the soil pH and the soil characteristics. So like all of our fruits, blueberries need full sun, but the real sticker with blueberries is that pH, that soil pH of 4.5 to 5.5. Anything higher than that, the plants will just fail to thrive. I've had some circumstances where folks that are really dedicated organic gardeners say, if I just push the organic matter and push the organic matter, my plants will be fine. But that's, to me, that's anecdotal. I haven't seen any good studies that say, if I just push the organic matter, the pH doesn't matter. So, something always interesting to think about. But there's a very good reason blueberries need that low pH. It's because they developed in boggy areas and they need lots of iron. And to get the iron they need the soil pH to be lower, because that's when iron is more easily available to the plants in the soil solution. Blueberries have some weird lack of root hairs, all this weird plant science stuff that is really fascinating and also really frustrating and irritating when you just want to grow a plant. But it makes it really difficult for them to get the iron they need. And then the next question is, well, can't I just, spray iron on the plants or things like that? And that doesn't necessarily, it's not going to make up for the soil pH all the way. So fertile, well-drained soils, high organic matter soils. Basically, think about a bog. You know, you want high organic matter, peaty soils that have lots of water access, but they don't want their roots wet. So like they want the water like 2 feet down, so like it's there, they can sip it when they want it. That is a blueberry. It's a bog plant, and Kansas is not a bog. So that soil pH is our big limiting factor. If you have a site, you are starting with a pH of 5.5 to 6.5, that is when it's going to be more financially viable. You know, if you've got money to throw at blueberries and you're just growing them for yourselves, there's lots of things you can do. You can, you know, build yourself an in-ground container with peat moss and, you know, or grow in bales of peat moss. There are ways to grow blueberries in Kansas on a very small scale. But once you start getting on a larger, more production scale, it becomes pretty cost prohibitive pretty quickly. So you have to know where your starting soil pH is. If your starting soil pH is less than 7, you can probably get it where it needs to be and maintain it. But you're also going to need to test your water pH regularly. You may need to add some acid into your water to keep your water pH from pulling your soil pH up. You may need to kind of assess your soil characteristics. You know, do you have, even though your soil pH is low, do you have a really high calcium level in your soil that's going to start creeping that up over time? You know, it's doable, but you're going to become an expert in chemistry and water management and fertility management to keep it going and going productively. You know, unless, you know, one of the blueberry U-picks that I've worked with, you know, they're just in this really perfect microclimate. You know, it's a perfect microclimate and their soil was perfect from the get-go. You know, it's kind of in this little valley and had been grazed for a long time, had high organic matter. You know, so if you find one of those perfect scenarios, you jump on it. But beyond that, prepare yourself for quite a bit of work. Types of blueberries out there. There's northern high bush, southern high bush. We are kind of in the middle. You know, we're a little bit warm for northern high bush. We're a little bit cold for southern high bush. You know, so kind of one of those weird things about Kansas as well. There's also half high varieties, which are crosses between high and low bush types. And then there's low bush blueberries. So they all have slightly different growth of the plants, slightly different fruit size and characteristics. Most of the time in Kansas, you're looking at some type of high bush or maybe a half high. The low bush are kind of fun from an ornamental standpoint. Containers, you know, they might be a better choice. But from a picking standpoint, low bush are literally a pain to deal with. So, you know, on the left, you've got some pretty mature high bush plants. You can see those are big plants and they're growing into that aisle. You know, on the right-hand side, these are a lot more immature plants. They're only a year or two old. And you can see some of them in this particular case, the leaves are a little bit yellow, they're chlorotic, they're not getting the iron they need, the pH is off, you know, so there's some challenges from a management standpoint. You're usually looking at 3 to 5 years from planting a young root blueberry to the point where you're going to have a mature amount of production. And that's if the birds don't get them all. So bird management is a thing as well. Blueberry picking can be fun or it can be slow and tedious, depending on the variety and the ripeness. And like any other berries, cool them quickly. But blueberries do hold on the bushes a little bit longer than like your strawberries, raspberries, blackberries. You know, if you don't get them off the day or two that they hit peak ripeness, you've usually got another day or two to go before they just kind of get out of hand. Okay, some of the questions, watering system options. Most of the time with berries, I'm going to recommend a drip irrigation system. There are times that you do want access to overhead, like with strawberries on a larger scale, you may want overhead irrigation from a frost management standpoint. But usually you're going to be looking at some sort of drip type system because they need so much water. You want your water to be as efficient as possible. You don't want water getting lost to evaporation if you can at all avoid it. So I have a creek on the back of my property that stays moist in the area, has a microclimate, cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter. You know, if that's where you're looking at growing, that could be an excellent location. You know, be sure to kind of take some time, make sure, you know, maybe plant a few things, see how they do. But, you know, definitely a spot that's cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter could be a great choice for a planting area. Okay. Let's see. We are getting to the point where we're out of time. Do you want me to keep going, Jeff? What do you want me to do, Scott? Any preference? Keep going?
Yeah, I would say you can keep going here for a little bit.
Okay. Well, I just have a few slides on grapes, so we can look at those. So grapes, you know, again, different types to consider. American grapes are more the Concord types. You know, think of them like the jelly flavor, classic grape jelly. Then there's French American hybrids that are you know, often used more as wine type grapes. A lot of the true French wine grape varieties do not grow well in the center part of the US. We're too cold in the winter, we're too hot in the summer, we have too much humidity, too many insects, diseases. Particularly those wine grapes are just incredibly difficult to grow. And even some of the hybrids are a real challenge. I didn't update this slide, but there's also actually some really interesting breeding work that's been done at the University of Arkansas, and they've released just in the last 5 years or so some really interesting looking table grape varieties that are developed more for this center part of the U.S. I actually bought one of them last year and planted it in my yard, so I'm crossing my fingers for some grapes this year. We'll see how that goes. But definitely some more interesting options. I know one of the reasons they worked on breeding those table grape varieties is, you know, all the table grape varieties were developed for like California and those types of climates. So if you've never eaten a table grape right off of the plant, you know, that's not like a grocery store type, they are night and day difference. Like we have a table grape variety in our demonstration garden. It's a green yellow variety called Himrod. And my kids love it. Like that's what they want. You know, they're like, when are the grapes ready? When are the grapes ready? Now they love grocery store grapes too, to be fair, but they are not anywhere similar in any regard. And I think it's a really interesting potential market opportunity, you know, to look at some of those table grape varieties and see what the potential could be for those. Beyond just, you know, a lot of folks are interested in the wine grapes. So same deal, full sun. Grapes are interesting in that they often will tolerate poor fertility soils, and sometimes high fertility soils, meaning that they have lots of nutrients, can cause excessive vegetative growth. So it's kind of one of those, you know, if you think about when you know, what you traditionally think of as grape country, it's like rocky hillsides and stuff like that. So they do need some deep soils, but they'll tolerate that poor fertility. Still more acidic soil pH, and again with the frost pockets, something to keep in mind. Biggest thing with grapes is the trellising and the pruning. The cost of getting those trellises in properly is a huge expense up front, especially the more acres that you're going to put into those grapes. And You know, a general guideline that I've seen for a long time is that if you're going that vineyard wine grape route, you really have to kind of pencil out and expect that it could be up to 10 years before you have paid off all of your installation debts and you're fully profitable, just because of the expense of the trellises and the plant material and then the pruning labor and the maintenance labor, et cetera, until you start getting the yields that are going to pay you back. So, you know, some different looks at what a mature grape plant is going to be, you know, that main trunk and then lots of growth every single year. One of the biggest challenges for someone that's new to growing grapes is the pruning. You know, high pruning, high skill level to know how to prune and what to prune off. If you are really, really serious about understanding grapes and the ins and outs of grapes, I strongly encourage you to connect with the Kansas Grape Growers and Winemakers Association. They have great resources. And then Highland Community College, they have some area planted near Manhattan, and then they have other areas. I believe it's Hiawatha. Scott will tell me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. But they have they have a lot of classes, the viticulture, the enology, all of those classes. Some are available remotely online. This year, I'd probably imagine more. They also do hands-on pruning sessions. You know, so connect with those organizations if grapes are your passion and where you want to go, because you do not want to invest the money and not learn how to do it properly. You know, so in a very general sense, with a grapevine, you have that main trunk, you have your canes, and then all the side shoots are pruned off every single year. You're removing up to 90% of the vine every year. And that is so terrifying for a new grape grower to figure out how to prune and what to prune and things like that. So one of the best ways to learn that pruning is find someone who knows it and learn from them, you know, and watch them prune and prune alongside them, rather than, you know, looking at the drawings on a slide is not going to cut it for the grape growing and the pruning for sure. Okay, so that was a tiny little bit on grapes, and hopefully pointed you in the right direction on that. I'm going to skim through the high tunnels pretty quickly. We've touched on this a little bit. If you're not familiar with a high tunnel, it's an unheated greenhouse, different types, you know, lots of different technologies available to high tunnels anymore. Some of the benefits to considering fruit in a high tunnel is that it helps with some of those late frost issues and can extend your harvest season. One of the things that I find most intriguing about high tunnels and fruit is, you know, the potential market value of having raspberries and strawberries that are locally produced in that November, December timeframe when people are spending money on holiday dinners and things like that, or early spring, you know, Easter timeframe, you know, and that sort of thing with strawberries. So, you know, I still feel like the potential is there. I don't know that many people have really dialed in how to do it productively, and it may not pencil out as well as I think in my head that it should work. The other benefit of high tunnels is, you know, Kansas has all these weather and climate issues. We have wind, we have rain, we have sun, and so your high tunnels can help mitigate some of those challenges with your berries a little bit. The biggest thing with berries in high tunnels is just partly weed management and partly that spacing aspect. You know, a high tunnel is an investment, and, you know, to have a perennial in there that you're not turning over multiple times, and that can get gangly and a little bit crazy can be a challenge. So there's definitely a high management requirement in there, some pollination considerations to keep in mind, like how are you going to get your pollinators in when you need them in? the potential heat in the summer and that whole plant spacing issue. So this was a research tunnel where they were doing some, I think they were actually doing some spacing studies. And if you've never dealt with brambles, just looking at that is kind of scary. So you can see the downside really clearly right there. So strawberries are probably a much easier sell in a high tunnel, either fall or spring planted day neutrals, or sometimes fall planted June bearing varieties. I know that Dr. Rivard, who will be the next speaker on this series, he's done quite a bit of research looking at annual strawberry production, both in and out of high tunnels, and so may have some good insights on that as well. Usually you're looking at plastic mulch raised beds, some row covers, things like that. But I think usually what they find is that the investment pays for itself with, that early strawberry production at the market. Lots of other things you can do with strawberries. The biggest challenge is balancing the input costs with the value of what you get out of them. One of the other things with raspberries and blackberries in a high tunnel that I've seen some research done on, be interesting to kind of do some further digging and research and see what makes sense, is they're looking at, can you grow them in pots and move them inside for the harvest season, to extend that harvest season in the fall, or in the early spring to get an earlier season out of them. And then move them outdoors so you can use that tunnel for other types of production during the rest of the year, rather than tying up a whole high tunnel with just that perennial crop. So some interesting options there. I'm happy to take any questions. I know a lot of the things y'all are interested in, the elderberries and cherries and what have you, we did not get to tonight. I will call out a few other learning opportunities that are coming up here. Scott mentioned the Growing Growers ICT program. We are in our 3rd year this year. That is a new farmer training program specifically focused on fruit and vegetable producers. And so we have a variety of ways you can participate in that program. We do apprenticeships where we'll match you with a host farm. And, just even for those of you that are not in Sedgwick County, like we've had apprentices from outside Sedgwick County, and they've even apprenticed on farms outside Sedgwick County. So even though I'm based in Sedgwick County, we'll connect you with your local extension folks, but also host farms and other workshops, tours, and hands-on learning. Apprenticeship maybe isn't where you're at. We'll have workshops that go a lot more in depth, a whole workshop on soils, a whole workshop on irrigation, things like that, farm tours to see what's working on existing farms, hands-on learning opportunities, one-on-one consultations, all that jazz. So you can learn more on our website. If you are closer to Kansas City, they have a Growing Growers program up there, and you should take advantage of those opportunities because they'll match you with host farms up in that area. But if you're kind of south central Kansas, and that seems like you might be interested, feel free to reach out to us and we'll see about getting you involved with that. Other things, direct-to-consumer workshops sponsored by Kansas Department of Ag and K-State Research and Extension coming up the middle of February. Those are also fully virtual, $5 for the whole week. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is over the lunch hour. Friday is 8:30 to 12:30. A lot of it's focused on the rules and regulations, food labeling, and all that fun stuff, poultry regs, etc. But there's also a really great keys in farmers markets and direct to consumer marketing. And if you register, you have the opportunity to sign up to get a free scale certification. So you have to register under your own name to get that. So take advantage of that opportunity coming up here in a couple weeks. And then also because, we're not all sick and tired of being on Zoom 24/7, the Great Plains Growers Conference is being held virtually as well, February 12th and 13th. Normally this is in person up in St. Joe, Missouri area, sometimes Nebraska, move it around a little bit. And they have multiple tracks. You get to hear from great experienced growers doing a whole bunch of unique things from different states in the Great Plains. So one of, if there's a side benefit to 2020, 2021, it's that you can get a taste of that conference virtually and get some of that learning without having to trek all the way to Missouri or Nebraska when it could potentially snow or ice on top of you. So, really, really encourage you to give that a shot this year and see how worth it can be, so that maybe next year you might consider it worth it to go in person. But they, I think, have 4 different tracks. One whole track is on fruit production, if that's what you're interested in, really delving more deeply into. Whole tracks on sustainable and organic vegetable production, marketing, you name it, they've got it. Take a look and get more into all of the options with fruits and vegetables. So I'm, again, happy to take any last questions you might have, and you can always reach out to me if you've got further questions or looking for more resources. I know Jeff sent out the resource list, so I tried to find a lot of, kind of varied publications. One of the things that I always tell folks is here in Kansas, and it is a challenge for us because we do not have any fruit researchers. We don't have any specialists, any folks in the hort department that their specialty is fruit and their research focus is fruit. And so there have been so many advances in cultivars, production methods in the last 30 to 40 years. And we don't have in-house in our K-State arsenal a whole lot of resources on those things. And so I've tried to kind of curate some good resources for you on that resource list from other universities and other entities. That's only a sample of the things out there. So when you're looking for more information, I encourage you to start by looking at Oklahoma resources, look at Arkansas resources, Missouri resources, Nebraska resources. Colorado can have some things that are useful to us, but they're so much cooler with the mountains and drier. They're a very different climate, so it's not necessarily as relevant. And then, Iowa has some pretty good information. And then beyond that, a lot of the, things to keep in mind, if you look at states that are kind of on the same latitude as us, like Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, they're going to be similar temperature wise and humidity wise to what we're experiencing. And, but they have a lot more water than we do. So not everything's relevant. You go to some of the more Midwestern states, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, they're a lot colder than we are in a lot of cases. And so you have to be really careful about the timelines, of their guidelines and what they expect things to look like. But they have a lot of fruit production, so they're really up to date on the newest cultivars and the most recent research on growing practices and things like that. So there's lots of great information out there. It's just figuring out how to make it relevant to Kansas. And I'm happy to help with that. I think most of your extension agents that you can work with will be happy to help you kind of sort through some of that information, or they know to direct you to Scott or myself or one of the hort agents if need be.